The story of Saint Stanislaus Kostka begins in Poland, within a noble and devout family. Born on October 28, 1550, he was the second of 7 children of Jan Kostka and his wife Małgorzata. Since childhood, Stanislaus demonstrated a deep inclination towards spirituality and had an unusual sensitivity towards the things of God. His devotion caught the attention of those around him, who saw in him a special disposition for religious life. Poland at the time of Stanislaus was experiencing an intense phase of Catholic fervor, driven by the Counter-Reformation and by religious orders that worked hard to spread the values of the gospel. Amid this context, Stanislaus' parents were eager to provide a quality education for their children, including a solid Christian formation. This initial training was crucial in awakening in him the desire to follow the path of holiness. From a very young age, Stanislaus already revealed a calm, humble, and obedient temperament. His mother, a woman of great faith, encouraged the little one to dedicate himself to God, teaching him prayers and Christian virtues. She guided him gently, pointing out to him the value of spiritual life and charity towards others. These early teachings planted seeds that would later blossom in extraordinary ways. Upon reaching adolescence, Stanislaus was sent along with his brother Paulo to study at the renowned Jesuit college in Vienna, Austria. The journey was long and full of challenges, but the young man was excited to learn and grow in faith. In Vienna, Stanislaus saw the opportunity to get closer to the Jesuits, whose way of life deeply inspired him. He admired the spirit of mission and discipline of the religious. The Jesuit school was an environment of academic rigor and intense spirituality. There, Stanislaus soon stood out for his exemplary behavior, his piety and dedication to his studies. Unlike many young people his age, he preferred to dedicate hours to prayer and reading the scriptures, always seeking a more intimate connection with God. Stanislaus cultivated an intense inner life of communion with the divine. However, his journey in Vienna was not easy. He and his brother were forced to live in the house of a Lutheran, a man hostile to the Catholic faith, which generated constant tension. This gentleman, upon learning of Stanislaus's fervent devotion, often persecuted and ridiculed him, trying to undermine his faith. However, Stanislaus endured these adversities with patience and humility, strengthening himself in his dedication to God. Amid this atmosphere of hostility, Stanislaus delved even deeper into prayer, seeking in Christ the relief and strength to endure the daily trials. He faced loneliness and persecution with an impressive spiritual maturity for a young man of his age. His trust in God was such that nothing diverted him from his path of piety and total dedication. The intensity of his faith was such that, at a certain point, Stanislaus fell seriously ill. Lying in his bed, he felt like he was nearing his last hour. Unable to receive the sacraments due to the hostility of his host, Stanislaus addressed a fervent prayer to Saint Barbara, known as the patron saint of a good death, begging for her intercession so that he could receive the Eucharist. In response to his prayer, Stanislaus experienced a miraculous vision. Saint Barbara appeared at his side, bringing with her 2 angels and the Holy Sacrament. Stanislaus, ecstatic, received communion from the saint's hands, strengthening his faith and confirming his special calling. This miracle profoundly marked his life and further increased his desire to give himself completely to God. After this event, Stanislaus recovered from his illness and decided that his life would be entirely dedicated to God. His desire to join the Society of Jesus intensified, but he knew he would face great obstacles. His parents, especially his father, were against the idea of him becoming religious. The Kostka family hoped that the young man would pursue a diplomatic career, a noble and respectable tradition at the time. Faced with family opposition and the certainty of his calling, Stanislaus did not hesitate. Determined to join the Jesuit order, he made a courageous decision: flee Vienna and seek refuge with the Jesuits in Augsburg Germany. At just 17 years old, he walked a long and arduous journey, motivated by faith and the conviction that this was God's will for his life. In Augsburg, Stanislaus was welcomed by the provincial of the Society of Jesus, who saw in him an extraordinarily virtuous young man. However, due to the sensitivity of the situation with his family, the provincial suggested that he continue his journey to Rome, where he could find greater security and finally fulfill his desire to become a Jesuit. Stanislaus promptly accepted the advice and left for the Eternal City. Arriving in Rome, Stanislaus was admitted as a novice by the Jesuits. His dedication to religious life was absolute. He lived in profound humility, joyfully accepting the simplest tasks and daily sacrifices. His prayer life was intense, and he spent long hours in contemplation, always seeking union with God. For him, every moment was an opportunity to grow in holiness. Reports from his companions describe Stanislaus as a young man of unshakable faith and great purity of heart. He had a special devotion to the Virgin Mary, to whom he entrusted all his anxieties and joys. The Mother of God was a constant consolation for him and an inspiration to persevere on his path of holiness. He used to say that he would rather die than commit a sin, no matter how small. In the midst of his life as a novice, Stanislaus began to feel a deep desire to see God face to face. His prayer became a plea for the Lord to allow him to go to heaven at a young age, so that he could be united with him eternally. This ardent desire for union with God was, at the same time, a reflection of his holiness and his pure soul, totally detached from worldly values. However, his plea seemed like an impossible request. He was young and healthy, with a promising religious life ahead of him. But Stanislaus knew that God had plans for each of his children and trusted entirely in divine providence. His life continued to be marked by obedience, humility, and total surrender, living each day as if it were his last, in the full certainty that heaven was his true home. In August 1568, a year after joining the Society of Jesus, Stanislaus suddenly fell ill. His health, once vigorous, began to weaken rapidly. The doctors and his companions tried to help him in every way, but Stanislaus' condition worsened every day. Even in the midst of suffering, he maintained peace and serenity, knowing that perhaps this was the moment of his departure. In his last days, Saint Stanislaus had visions of Our Lady and the angels, which filled his heart with comfort and joy. He knew that his time was coming and that he would soon be in full communion with God. He asked his companions to keep the faith and not to worry about him, as he was at peace with his vocation and the love of God. In the early hours of August 15th, 1568, the day of the Assumption of Our Lady, Stanislaus Kostka gave his soul to God. He was only 18 years old, but he had already lived a life of dedication and purity that impressed everyone who knew him. His death was accompanied by signs of peace and grace, which confirmed to his Jesuit brothers the holiness of that young man. After his death, Stanislaus Kostka's reputation for holiness spread quickly throughout Europe. Many considered his life and his dedication to be a true example of purity and devotion. His intercession began to be sought by young people who wished to follow the path of holiness, and by those who faced difficulties in their faith, finding in him a model of perseverance and love for God. The testimony of Saint Stanislaus, even after his death, continued to inspire hearts. His zeal for purity, his obedience and his humility captivated those who knew his story. The Jesuits who had lived with him spoke movingly about the examples of faith he demonstrated in his short life. The young saint began to be remembered in preaching and prayers as a model of holiness. After his death, many miracles began to be attributed to Stanislaus's intercession. Reports of healing and conversion multiplied, especially among young people. Stanislaus became a powerful intercessor for those who sought strength to persevere in their faith. The Church, realizing the growing devotion to the young Jesuit, began the processes for his beatification. The path to the canonization of Saint Stanislaus, however, was not immediate. For several years, his life was carefully examined, and his example was compared to the Church's standards for official recognition of a saint. Even in the face of this rigor, Stanislaus's holiness was evident, and his purity and unshakable faith ended up overcoming any doubts. Finally, Stanislaus was beatified by Pope Clement XI in 1605, less than 40 years after his death. The official recognition of his holiness was received with great joy by the faithful, especially in Poland, his homeland, where the cult of the young saint was already strong and widespread. Stanislaus then became one of the most beloved saints among Poles. The canonization of Saint Stanislaus took place in 1726 under the pontificate of Pope Benedict XIII, who proclaimed him a saint. Bento XIII highlighted the example of purity and dedication that Stanislaus had given to the world, especially inspiring young people. It was then that he began to be venerated as the patron saint of youth, becoming a symbol of perseverance and unconditional love for God. Devotion to Saint Stanislaus Kostka spread throughout Europe and beyond. In his native Poland, he was welcomed as a true spiritual hero, a symbol of purity and holiness that transcended his country's borders. Churches and chapels were dedicated to him, and many young Catholics over the centuries continued to invoke his intercession in times of difficulty and temptation. The life of Saint Stanislaus also had a great impact within the Jesuit order itself. His brothers in the community saw him as a model novice, someone who, in his short life, had perfectly fulfilled the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. He became an example for all young religious people, a constant reminder of what it means to surrender oneself entirely to the will of God. To this day, Saint Stanislaus is remembered not only for his purity, but also for his courage. Leaving his comfortable life and defying his family's authority for the sake of his vocation was an act of great bravery. Many young people found inspiration in his story to seek their own vocation and live Christ's teachings intensely. The liturgical feast of Saint Stanislaus Kostka is celebrated on November 13th. On this day, in various parts of the world, especially in Poland and in Jesuit communities, he is honored with special masses and prayers. The Church celebrates his memory as that of a young man who found his true joy in God and spared no effort to follow the path of holiness. St. John Paul II, the Polish Pope, was a great devotee of St. Stanislaus and often mentioned his life as an example of fidelity for young people. On his pilgrimages to Poland, John Paul highlighted the importance of Stanislaus as a model of holiness and encouraged young people to follow his example, to live faith with courage and not to fear total surrender to God. The purity of Saint Stanislaus is a characteristic that has always impressed the faithful. In a time of great moral challenges, he showed that true happiness lies in remaining faithful to the teachings of Christ and one's own conscience. He was an unwavering defender of the virtue of chastity, understanding that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit and that purity is a way of honoring God. His example is particularly valuable for young people who today face a series of temptations and challenges that test their faith and purity. Saint Stanislaus is a model of resistance and fidelity to evangelical values, reminding young people that it is possible to live a holy life even in the midst of trials and difficulties. A notable aspect of his spirituality was his deep devotion to the Virgin Mary. Stanislaus saw the Mother of God as a source of consolation and strength. He often prayed the Rosary and entrusted all his needs and anxieties to Our Lady. The Marian devotion he cultivated was one of the pillars of his faith, and he recommended that all young people entrust themselves to Mary's maternal care. This Marian devotion was confirmed in his visions, in which he received visits and consolations from the Virgin Mary herself. This fact was interpreted as a sign of Our Lady's predilection for him, and also as a stimulus for all those who, like Stanislaus, wished to live a life of holiness and consecration to God. Another strong point in the life of Saint Stanislaus was his spirit of penance. Although he was young, he understood the importance of mortifying himself to control the inclinations of the flesh and strengthen the soul against temptations. With this, he maintained a pure heart and a mind always focused on the things of God, living in the constant presence of the Lord. Humility was another essential virtue in the life of Saint Stanislaus. Even though he came from a noble family and had a promising future by world standards, he never sought glory or recognition. Instead, he preferred anonymity and simpler tasks, seeing in them opportunities to offer God a sacrifice of love and humility. For him, greatness was in serving, not in being served. Stanislaus taught by his example that true nobility lies in the willingness to help others, to do good without expecting rewards, and to love God above all things. This humility captivated everyone who knew him and continues to be an example for all who aspire to holiness. In the midst of a society often focused on materialism and individualism, the example of Saint Stanislaus is a powerful reminder that true happiness is found in surrender to God and service to others. He lived to please the Lord and to seek the good of those around him, which is why his story continues to be a source of inspiration for so many generations. Saint Stanislaus Kostka is also a model of courage for those who face difficulties in their spiritual journey. He did not hesitate to leave everything to follow Christ, even though he knew that it would mean a break with his family and a life of renunciation. He fully trusted in divine providence and believed that God would take care of every detail of his life. Stanislaus's courage reminds Christians that the path to holiness requires renunciation and sacrifice. It is not easy to give up the comforts and security of the world to follow God, but Saint Stanislaus proved that this choice is worth it. His life is an invitation for each believer to examine their heart and evaluate whether they are really willing to do anything for the love of Christ. Another central aspect of Saint Stanislaus's life was his intense prayer life. Since childhood, he had a deep relationship with God, and this closeness was cultivated daily through meditation, silence, and contemplation. For him, prayer was not just a religious practice, but a vital necessity, a moment of intimacy and sincere dialogue with the Lord. Even during his youth, amid his obligations and studies, he remained firm in his prayer routine. He often spent long periods in worship and reflection, seeking to understand God's will for his life. This dedication to prayer shaped his character and gave him the strength he needed to face the trials that came his way. Saint Stanislaus's faith was nourished by the sacrament of the Eucharist, which he deeply venerated. Whenever he could, he participated in Holy Mass and made a point of taking communion with devotion. He understood the immeasurable value of Christ's presence in the Eucharist and believed that this communion was the essential nourishment for his soul. In fact, it was his spiritual hunger for the Eucharist that led him to experience one of the most remarkable miracles of his life when, seriously ill, he was visited by St. Barbara, who brought the body of Christ to him. This miracle further strengthened his faith and demonstrated the closeness of God in his life, confirming his special call to holiness. In his short period as a Jesuit novice, Saint Stanislaus was also known for his charity towards others. He was always willing to help his colleagues and dedicated himself to caring for the sick and those in need. His generosity was a reflection of his love for God, and he saw in each person the image of Christ, treating everyone with compassion and kindness. For the young Jesuits of his time, Stanislaus' charity and humility were a constant example. He showed that true holiness is not just in prayers and penances, but in serving others and practicing virtues on a daily basis. Through small gestures of love and care, he revealed the presence of Christ to his companions. Discipline was another striking feature in the life of Saint Stanislaus. He strictly followed the rules of the Jesuit community, even in the smallest things. He didn't look for facilities or avoid the simplest jobs. For him, discipline and obedience were expressions of love for God and a means of molding character in humility and service. Many of those who lived with him were impressed by his willingness to obey without question, even when the task was arduous or required sacrifices. Stanislaus saw every moment of obedience as an opportunity to offer God a silent and discreet sacrifice, an offering of love made with total sincerity and detachment. In his meditations and reflections, Stanislaus often pondered the brevity of life and the need to always be prepared for an encounter with God. He understood that earthly life was fleeting and that the true treasure was in eternity. This understanding helped him to live detached from material goods and always seek heavenly things. This perspective on life and death was a sign of his spiritual maturity. Saint Stanislaus did not fear death, as he knew it would bring him closer to God. For him, death was a passage to eternal life, a reunion with the Lord he loved so much. This thought comforted him, especially in times of illness and suffering. Even after his departure, Saint Stanislaus continues to be an example of holiness for all the faithful. He showed that age is not an obstacle to the search for God, and that the true vocation to holiness does not depend on circumstances, but on a heart determined to serve and love the Creator above all else. The life of Saint Stanislaus is a constant reminder that holiness is accessible to everyone, as long as there is a willingness to follow God's will. He lived a simple and profound spirituality based on trust and love for the Lord, which inspires many to this day. His example invites us to seek a more authentic relationship with God. Over the centuries, the Church has continued to promote the memory and example of Saint Stanislaus. His story is often presented in catechesis and homilies, especially for young people. The Church sees him as an ideal model for those who are in search of a greater purpose and who wish to live a life of purity and dedication. Saint Stanislaus is remembered especially as the patron saint of youth and purity. His intercession is sought by young people who struggle to maintain chastity and to live Christian values in a world that often moves away from the teachings of Christ. He is a sign of hope for those who want to remain faithful to their faith. In various parts of the world, churches and chapels were dedicated to Saint Stanislaus, and his image is venerated as a reminder of his life of dedication and love for God. These churches are places of prayer and refuge for those who seek the saint's intercession, especially in times of trial and doubt. The life of Saint Stanislaus is also a testimony to the importance of courage and determination in the search for one's vocation. He did not hesitate to face his family's resistance and the difficulties along the way to follow God's call. His story is a reminder that the vocation must be followed with courage and perseverance. Stanislaus' faith was so deep that he felt strengthened to withstand any challenge. He knew that God was with him and that regardless of the obstacles, the divine will would always prevail. His trust in God was absolute, and this trust inspired everyone around him. The spirituality of Saint Stanislaus is marked by devotion and simplicity. He did not seek extraordinary mystical experiences, but a constant union with God in everyday life. He taught, by his example, that holiness can be found in small things, in simple actions and gestures of love and humility. The reports of his novitiate companions reveal a young man who deeply loved God and who was moved by a serene and constant joy. Even in moments of trial, Stanislaus remained at peace, as he knew he was on the path that God had marked out for him. This serenity was a reflection of his unshakable faith. His trust in divine providence was evident in every aspect of his life. Stanislaus believed that God took care of every detail and that nothing happened by chance. This faith helped him overcome difficult times and face the challenges that arose with courage, always placing his life in the hands of the Creator. In his canonization, Pope Benedict XIII highlighted the purity and courage of Saint Stanislaus as examples to be followed. He saw in Stanislaus a model for youth, someone who showed the world that it is possible to live with purity and total surrender to God, even at such a young age. The Catholic Church promoted devotion to Saint Stanislaus, especially among young people, encouraging them to seek his intercession and imitate his example of life. He is seen as a protector and friend of young people, someone who understands the difficulties and temptations they face and who intercedes for them with God. Saint Stanislaus is also a symbol of fidelity. Even in the face of trials, he remained faithful to his calling and the teachings of Christ. This fidelity is one of the virtues that the Church highlights in its life and that encourages all the faithful to cultivate in their own path of faith. His life reminds us of the importance of trusting in divine providence. He taught, by his example, that God never abandons those who place their hope in him, and that even in moments of pain and uncertainty, we can trust in the Father's love. To this day, Saint Stanislaus is remembered as an example of purity, humility, and courage. His life and intercession continue to inspire young people to pursue holiness and live a God-centered life. He is proof that true happiness lies in fidelity to the gospel. The testimony of Saint Stanislaus is an invitation to all the faithful to reflect on their own vocation and to renew their commitment to Christ. He reminds us that each one is called to holiness and that, with faith and trust, we can overcome all adversities to unite with God. For young people, the story of Saint Stanislaus is an inspiration to live an authentic Christian life and to seek the realization of evangelical values. He teaches that youth can be a time of great spiritual growth and that God has a special plan for each person. Devotion to Saint Stanislaus also reminds us of the importance of seeking the intercession of the saints. He who went through so many trials and remained faithful intercedes for those who face difficulties and wish to live a holy life. The story of Saint Stanislaus Kostka continues to be told around the world as a testimony to the grace of God working in the life of a young man determined to follow the gospel. He is an example of the strength of faith and the depth of love for God. May the life of Saint Stanislaus inspire us all to seek holiness with the same ardor. May your intercession strengthen us on our journey and help us to always follow the path of Christ, remembering that, like him, we are called to live fully for God.